For many viewers in the UK, Seeding of a Ghost will be, along with Hex and Black Magic, their very first introduction to Hong Kong horror cinema. Hong Kong horror cinema is not as well known in the West as that from Japan, South Korea and even Thailand, which sort of had that very brief moment with Shutter when many in the West and outside of Asia started to kind of look into comparable films. So what's really interesting is, the fact that we're now retrospectively going back and looking at Hong Kong horror films via this 88 Films line, and I think that there's really interesting ideas in there, and I hope that building on the Shaw Brothers horror films such as Black Magic, such as Hex, and such as Seeding of a Ghost, we can start to kind of also look at other films which came after this and maybe question why it was that Hong Kong horror cinema, especially at a time when it was a British colony, never really took off in the West, and including the UK, where you would expect that there would be this interest in what's going on in a British territory, but it never happened, and I'm not really sure why that is, but it raises questions that I sort of find quite interesting to try and answer. Seeding of a Ghost, for instance, was released in Hong Kong in late 1983. Hong Kong films at the time, there was a real demand in the territory for new product, and this was because there was a huge amount of cinemas, and cinema tickets were very affordable, and Hong Kong is a place which was very much a movie culture. Part of the reason, in fact, that we have subtitles in these films, even if you go to Hong Kong today, every film you buy has English subtitles, and this is actually because when Hong Kong was under the administration of the Crown, after the anti-British riots of the 1960s, the British administration felt that they needed to have films with English subtitles on them so that they were aware of what was actually being said, and if there was any kind of subversive anti-British ideas in there, something could be done. Now there's this very long kind of train of thought now that Britain actually didn't want to give Hong Kong democracy and didn't actually want to give away Hong Kong, but the situation was a lot more complicated than that, and it leads to some of the ideas that we see in these films. But if we look back at the history of Hong Kong, after World War II, mainland China fell into a 4-year-long civil war led by Mao Zedong with his communist army against Chiang Kai-shek, who was based in Nanjing, with his nationalist government. Chiang Kai-shek, he fled with his army to Taiwan in 1949, and Taiwan was known and still is known as Republic of China, whereas mainland China was known as the People's Republic of China after 1949, when Mao's Liberation Army made Peking the headquarters of the Communist Party. For years after that, there was this friction between Taiwan and China as to which was the real China, with Chiang Kai-shek's China continuing the government that was in force in the mainland prior to 1949, and then Mao Zedong, of course, instigating the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. What you have during this period is the Western governments recognizing Chiang Kai-shek's China as the real China and accepting the idea of a one China principle, wherein Taiwan would reunite with the mainland under a Western-friendly government. So this led to a lot of problems with Hong Kong, because it was understood after World War II and the liberation of Hong Kong from the Japanese that Britain would eventually give Hong Kong back. But there's a question of what China it was going to give Hong Kong back to. And whenever the British government either suggested the idea of possibly an independent Hong Kong, which is still a very taboo subject to this day, or the idea of a Hong Kong which could self-govern itself, because Britain had given many of its colonies in Africa kind of, federalized powers, self-governing powers, such as, the former northern and southern Rhodesia, Nyasaland, which is now Malawi, South Africa, and so on and so forth. So there was the idea that perhaps Hong Kong could become like that. But whenever this was suggested, you had this flare-up in tension between Taipei, which is the capital of Taiwan, and Peking, Beijing in mainland China. Hong Kong was dependent on the mainland and still is for things like its water supply and its electricity. So there was an idea that all it would take would be for mainland China to switch these off, and Hong Kong would effectively be completely dependent on, starting from scratch with a huge amount of British costs. So Britain was very much sort of towing a line of not wanting to get involved in Hong Kong politics. Hong Kong was obviously coming up to the 1997 period where the lease on the new territories was going to come to a close, and Britain really didn't have any idea how that was going to conclude. Of course, we get to the 1970s, Richard Nixon goes to China. The West begins normalizing trade with Mao's China. As a result of this, Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan are ostracized from the UN. Mao takes a seat of the official China now, and we all recognize mainland China as a proper China, and the mainland line towards Taiwan is actually a rogue province which will eventually be brought under mainland rule. So, in light of the Taiwan situation, it was quite clear that Hong Kong was going to be handed back to the mainland. The introduction of Margaret Thatcher in the UK complicated this. Margaret Thatcher, of course, who went to war over the Falkland Islands, did not want to hand Hong Kong back, and she believed that she had an ace in her sleeve, which is that 8% of Hong Kong was actually leased to the British indefinitely. This was through the Opium Wars, which was when Britain kind of fought mainland China to, who were basically not wanting opium in their country, and Britain quite shamefully went to war in order to continue to sell opium into the mainland, and the reward for this was what is now Hong Kong Island, which at the time was some rocks with some hand fishermen on it. Hong Kong didn't really exist at this time. Hong Kong was built by exiles from mainland China and also by the British. So the building of Hong Kong was a really remarkable story in its own right. It was a very low tax, still is a very low tax area where there is great imbalance between rich and poor. It still feels like a very Western city, even after the handover to China. And this is where the friction comes from at present in Hong Kong. This Westernized part of Asia, which is really Western. If you've never been, Hong Kong does feel like a big British city in Asia. Yet you've got obviously this reunification with the mainland, and the true reunification is meant to have happened by 2047, where we're going to have the end of the one country, two systems. So you really need to understand this background to understand some of the Hong Kong horror films. Something like Seeding of a Ghost is really fascinating. It's fascinating because it's about black magic, and what a lot of people don't understand is under the Cultural Revolution of Mao, Chinese traditions, including superstitious traditions, were completely ostracized from the mainland. You couldn't practice these anymore. It effectively became, you risked persecution for hanging on to your cultural traditions. So these cultural traditions, they thrived in places like Taiwan and Hong Kong and Macau, which was a Portuguese colony up until 1999. So you had these traditions continue in China. And what you see in Seeding of a Ghost is you see the idea of this sort of old Chinese tradition being practiced, as black magic tradition, and of course it causes havoc for the people who practice this black magic. But not only do you have the practicing of black magic, you have this sense of old versus new. You have this sense of also a film which is, the Hong Kong. The Sino-British Agreement, which was 1984. Seeding of a Ghost is coming just before this, when Margaret Thatcher is pretty much negotiating a deal to hand Hong Kong back to the Chinese. So you have this sort of unease in Hong Kong at the time, and you have the beginning of what we now know as Category 3 films. And you see this in Seeding of a Ghost. You see things which could never, ever, ever play in a mainland cinema. Extensive sex, extensive full frontal nudity, really gruesome special effects, the channeling of ancient cultural ideas such as superstition and ghosts and black magic, now completely unthought of and undiscussed in mainland China. And you have these brought to the forefront in this 1983 film, which is kind of saying, you know, we're doing something really taboo, we're doing something really edgy. This is purely a Hong Kong film, this is Hong Kong identity. And it's this talking of this Hong Kong identity as we're basically sort of ascertaining this identity through these really garish and violent horror films, which are sort of, you know, basically saying, you know, these can never be Chinese films, these can never be Chinese ideas, you know, these are purely Hong Kong. These films are remarkably prophetic in a way, because they're sort of anticipating what you have now in Hong Kong with the protests and with the sense of, you know, what are we, you know? Are we really going to be, you know, another province of China in 2047? Questions which are being raised just now, we see in these old films. And this is why you had the Category 3 boom, which Seeding of a Ghost really leads us to understand Seeding of a Ghost and other really gritty, modern Hong Kong horror films, such as Black Magic, such as The Boxer's Omen. To really understand what these films are leading to, we need to look at the Category 3 boom. In 1988, Hong Kong finally introduced a rating system, and Category 3 was adults only. And that Category 3 idea became so indigenously Hong Kong. You know, you got films such as Herman Yau's Untold Story, which is set in Macau, and which is really violent. It's about this restaurant owner who is basically killing people and putting them in his pork buns. And we see police torture. We see the idea of a hidden identity, which, you know, is eventually going to be revealed. You know, but what is this untold story? What is this hidden identity? And you get the sense of, you know, this pre-handover Hong Kong, you know, is going to have to cover up its identity. It can't reveal its true past, you know. You get the idea of police torture, you know, this fear of the police, obviously, you know, speaking about this fear post-Tiananmen of mainland China coming in to be the new boss. You get films such as Dr. Lam, which once again focuses on police brutality, on a secret which needs to be forced out via torture by the police. You also get some really interesting Category 3 films which draw on you know, sexual crimes such as Run and Kill, and such as Raped by an Angel. Which are dealing with things like AIDS, like you know, the court system, like justice, like rape and revenge, you know. And these sort of things are really relevant to the Hong Kong of the time, which is starting to introduce things which are really radical for what would later become a part of mainland China, such as protecting women who had suffered domestic abuse. For instance, mainland China only introduced domestic abuse laws in 2016. Gay rights, mainland China only decriminalised homosexuality between men in 1997, the year of the handover. And this is why one of the most famous Category 3 films, of course, is Wong Kar-wai's Happy Together, which was a really groundbreaking film, not only starring Hong Kong's most famous and beloved actor, Leslie Cheung, who would later admit that he was bisexual, but it was a film which was really bringing these ideas out in the open. This is a Hong Kong in the Category 3 era, which is wanting to speak, wanting to talk, wanting to let us understand why it is so different, why it is its own kind of mind, its own kind of place. This is the Hong Kong that you're getting in films, even like Seeding of a Ghost, as trashy and as lowbrow as it is. It's still dealing with, you know, this can only come from Hong Kong. These ideas can only be Hong Kong, and they could only belong to a Hong Kong which is in transition, which has this fear of the future, this uncertainty. You have something like Ebola syndrome, where you have the great Anthony Wong playing a character who rapes a corpse in South Africa, and he comes back to Hong Kong, and he's got Ebola, and he goes around just coughing on people, trying to give people in the streets Ebola. And you know, the underlying metaphor of that seems to be, you know, that something rotten is about to come in, something really foreign is about to come into Hong Kong and destroy the territory from the inside out. These are films of great paranoia, these Category 3 films, and they really go back to what the Shaw Brothers films are doing with films like Seeding of a Ghost, like The Boxer's Omen, like Black Magic, which are films which are dealing, even though Black Magic's set in Malaysia and The Boxer's Omen is a lot of it set in Thailand, you're getting this idea of old tradition, you know, which has been kept alive in this you know, crown colony, kind of, you know, mixing in with you know, the modern Hong Kong identity, and you know, chaos ensuing. Because something just, you know, something just totally foreign has been thrown into the mix, you know. And Seeding of a Ghost is introducing these ideas, these thoughts, you know. At the very end, of course, we're in a suburban Hong Kong household, and everything erupts in the living room in a scene which actually looks like it's straight out of The Deadly Spawn, which you know, is obviously a massive coincidence, but because they were both released just about the same time. But you have this idea of, you know, the suburban being, you know, suburban modernity being infiltrated by you know, ancient cultural superstitions, so that the old versus the new of the Hong Kong identity, but also still the sense that something's going to come in here, something's going to change, something threatening is about to arrive. So you know, these films really anticipate the later Category 3 boom, and the Category 3 Hong Kong horror films, they're so of Hong Kong that, you know, it makes sense he never made it to Britain. In Britain, we were remarkably uninterested in Hong Kong. We're still remarkably uninterested in, you know, the former British territory and what is coming of it. So few British people actually seem up to date with Hong Kong these days. And, you know, it's kind of really interesting, if you do enjoy Seeding of a Ghost, to go and look at the later Category 3 films and to see an evolution through Hong Kong horror of a very specific indigenous identity, a unique identity which is dealing with going from being British to being Chinese, and which is channeling a lot of these thoughts. Now and again, with Category 3 Hong Kong horror films, you still get a really drastic and radical cultural identity. So for instance, if we look at a film such as Naked Ambition 2, which was a Category 3 film that came out recently with Josie Ho, and that's a film which is all about Hong Kong having its very own film identity. It's basically saying a big fuck you to anybody who thinks that Hong Kong is not a legitimate culture in its own right. And you get a film like Dream Home, which is actually one of the most xenophobic anti-mainland China films you'll ever see, because part of the anti-Chinese sentiment in Hong Kong has been that a lot of this new wealth which has been created in mainland China, you've had mainland entrepreneurs now moving to Hong Kong and driving up property prices. And you have in Dream Home Josie Ho basically trying to bring down the property prices by going into this big apartment complex and killing everybody really, really brutally. And not only, in the film's most shocking scene, you see her actually suffocate and kill a pregnant woman. It's kind of obvious what they're saying here, you know, that a new generation of the mainland cannot be here, sort of thing. It's a really quite xenophobic movie, but I think you sort of need to understand the Hong Kong Chinese tensions to sort of maybe look at the ideas that are going on even now in Category 3 Hong Kong horror. So if we want to look at Hong Kong horror, we need to look at Hong Kong as a territory, we need to look at Hong Kong's history, and we need to still look at what is coming out of Hong Kong in terms of its horror cinema, because if this is your first exposure to Hong Kong horror, all I can say is that you've opened up a treasure trove of interesting ideas and an entire genre which is in its own way even perhaps more fascinating than the films which we've seen come out of Japan and South Korea. So I hope this will inspire you to look at some of the films that I've mentioned, and also to hopefully begin a journey into visiting a part of the world which to this very day is, I still think, perhaps the greatest city on the planet. Please.